Hey readers, I'm Leandra.
And I'm Danny, and we are not reading for content.
This is a monthly book club podcast dedicated to reading in depth and leaving no plot point unturned. Each month, we read one book over the course of 3 episodes, basically reading one third of the book at a time. Feel free to listen along, or better yet, read the book with us. Our first season of the book club has the theme of genre blends. A list of books and the club schedule will be in the description.
This January, we are going to be reading the Village Library Demon Hunting Society, and we are so excited. Remember, today we will be discussing chapters 1 through 9 in the book. But before we get started on that, we need to do our bookish bite for the week. And this week, we're going to be discussing long titles. So we've noticed recently that this has become a trend in the bookish universe. And I just want to know your thoughts on it.
Well, I will say that it begins to be a mouthful. I understand that there is probably a goal among authors publishing to be unique and prevent the alternative. Whereas if you have a title that is just the place, the village, the man, there will probably be 4 or 5 other titles in history that will have that same title. And that can be really confusing. I mean, we see this in the book community all the time. I think that there are a handful of books that are called powerless. And we have to clarify, wait, which author are you talking about? Because we're crossing genres. So I understand why we have really long titles, but I also do find it a bit clunky. Like, this one has so many nouns. Give me an adjective. Give me a verb, more than one verb. I mean, the Village Library Demon Hunting Society. I have to take a breath. I don't know. I think that there can be a good flow of long titles. I mean, what is it? Like, Romantasy is known as the blank of blank and blank, right?
Yeah.
The thorns and roses, or whatever that's called. So, I can see where it works, but I think it's just like when it's noun upon noun upon noun, it starts to feel like a lot. So yeah, this is a good example of a title that I think is a bit too clunky. What about you?
I agree. I enjoy an interesting title, and I do understand the reasoning behind making titles longer because, as you say, it makes them more unique. But long doesn't always mean interesting. Sometimes we can have details, we can use words that are maybe a little unfamiliar, or even I really like it when a book puts something into the title that has a very significant meaning to the storyline. And this just kind of feels, I don't know, it feels very setting-ish. Let me tell you, like, it's like naming a book, London, England. You're like, "Okay."
Like, all right.
Except for, we have many, many more words in this title, but
Mhm.
hopefully the story will make up for it.
Yeah, that is a good point though, where it's just like, I wonder where it's going to be taking place. It's like, I think we know. Like, this isn't trying to pull like an Uno reverse on us. It's going to be set in a village with a library, and hey, there's going to be a demon hunting society. So I agree with you that I like it when there are really beautiful, thoughtful titles, or titles that nod to the story in a unique way. Even, for instance, our bonus book for December, The Cautious Traveler's Guide to the Wastelands.
Yeah.
That's a mouthful. That is a lot of words. I think it's more words technically than this one, like maybe one or two, but it flows a little bit better. And it has a pretty meaningful title, arguably, because this one journey is kind of broken up by sections from The Cautious Traveler's Guide to the Wastelands. Like, it is
Right.
actually a document that people follow throughout that story. So it kind of makes sense. Whereas this one, it could be a bit, I guess, satirical or poking fun because there's humor throughout this book, which we will get into. But I'm wondering if there were drafts of the title. I would love to know if there were multiple versions and then they finally settled on this one.
It would be really fun to be a fly on the wall in the room when all those decisions are made, because I know titles are not always an author decision either. That is sometimes publishing and marketing teams that decide the title. So it would be, I'm curious to know, like, who made that decision overall and how many drafts, yeah, they had beforehand.
Oh, for sure. And I promise, friends, we will get to the book, but this is a really fun discussion. So one last thing that I'll add is that talking about publishers making decisions, I mean, a really popular title, two popular books that I always think of when we discuss titles, especially really long ones that get altered, depending on if it's in the UK, the US, elsewhere, is the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. That is in the US, whereas in the UK, and I think most of the Commonwealth, it's just the 7 deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. The reason why in the US we got that extra half of death is because there was also the 7 husbands of Evelyn Hugo that was obviously making waves in the US and elsewhere. And clearly that wasn't the author's choice to be like, let me add another half of a death for my Americans. It's like, no, it was for some reason their thought was going to be that, oh, these two titles won't get mixed up as much when they clearly still do. Like
Oh,
people
yeah.
still confuse them. So I don't know. Sometimes it seems a bit silly.
I definitely have to remind myself whenever I'm talking about the deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. I constantly am like, wait, is it Evelyn Hugo or is it Evelyn Hardcastle?
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
So, speaking of, though, getting to the book, I hear that you have a bit of a synopsis for us.
I do. So let's switch gears over to the Village Library Demon Hunting Society by C.M. Wagner to provide some info about the author as well. This isn't a debut author. This author has published a couple times before. I think maybe the most well known title is, let me see if I can grab it, The Ruthless Lady's Guide to Wizardry. For me, at least, I recognized that title as soon as I heard of it. And I was like, oh, this is by the same author. Interesting. I haven't read the former title, but it has been on my radar. And I think that one's more potentially Regency era esque and it's fantasy romance, whereas this one is obviously for our fantasy mystery category. But what this book is about is that it follows librarian Sherry Pinkwhistle. She is kind of a well known figure in her village, which is Winesap, New York. So we're talking upstate New York. We see a lot of references to Ithaca, Albany. So we know that she is somewhere north of New York City. And she lives a very humble life. There is a lot of consistency where she wakes up and does the same routine every single morning. The one inconsistent thing is that people keep dying. I mean, the opening pages have her waking up one morning and feeling really good about herself because she has solved another murder. And then as the day progresses, we're thinking 24 hours later, probably another murder occurs. Sherry is approached at her job at the library by this young woman, and she says that her husband has been discovered at their art gallery, stabbed to death. So, this is a very brutal murder, and it starts off as a very kind of cozy mystery, very classic setting. And this murder ends up being solved pretty quickly, which, I don't think that's much of a spoiler. She's solved so many murders at this point. It's just another day job for her. But then another murder occurs. There are certain circumstances following this murder, and Sherry begins to realize there is more to this village than it seems, and Winesap might be far more sinister than your classic village setting. So, with that in mind, I think we can finally dig into this narrative. But, Danny, I think you need to provide everyone at home a bit of a spoiler warning.
Yes, in this podcast, we do not leave plot points unturned. We don't shy away from the details. So if you have not read chapters 1 through 9 and you are not looking for spoilers, now is the time for you to leave us and maybe come back after you've picked up the book for yourself.
Okay, so let's start talking about this book. Danny, what were your initial thoughts? We've been trying not to spoil things for each other so we can finally be open with each other. What are you thinking about this book?
Okay, so the thing I want to talk to you about is the tone of the book and when my thoughts on the book changed.
Okay.
So, throughout the first part of the story, when we are following Sherry solving the mysteries, solving the murders, being a little intrusive into the detectives world and um just being that person, kind of a little pretentious, a little bit of a know-it-all. I was hating it. I was so aggravated at the character and she was one of those characters that thinks that she's very clever and she really wasn't. Like, everything was very convenient, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, if I have to live with this woman saying that she's better than everyone else in the book for the next, 300 pages, I am going to scream." So I was like, kinda losing it a little bit. I was like, "Oh no, this is not gonna be a great book for me to start the podcast with." But we get to the point where Sherry's boyfriend dies. She doesn't like calling him her boyfriend, but that's what we're going to say that he is. So he dies, and it kind of shocks her into reality that there's something wrong. Like, she accounts for 16 deaths, and she said she stopped counting at 16. So really there's more than 16 deaths, and she realizes that there's something wrong. And she then goes into saying, like, why am I thinking that I'm like the cleverest person in the room? Like, I'm really just an average librarian. This isn't me. And that was when I started enjoying the story more. To be honest, the tone of the character in the beginning, when you are having these memory loss moments where she has this memory of there's a lot of deaths going on, and then instantly her mind would wipe and she'd forget that she was thinking about it. That type of almost unreliable narrator tone really reminded me of Death in Her Hands by Otessa Mashtoff, I think is how you pronounce her last name, which I liked that book, but that book was meant to be an exploration into someone's mind, and it was meant to have a certain tone, and I really didn't like it with this character. So I am glad that we changed gears. What are your first
Yeah.
thoughts?
I was honestly feeling as though this was your run of the mill cozy mystery. We were discussing in our kind of hype intro episode that we were a bit worried that there's a difference between cozy fantasy tone and cozy mystery tone. And I'm just not a fan of the cozy mystery tone. And that's what this was giving me. I felt as though we were getting so many characters. Everyone was just too in each other's business. And yeah, our main character, she did great on me, especially when there was a discussion where she was thinking, oh, I hate when everyone thinks that women are adorable. And I'm like, you are the classic, like, elderly sweet woman. Like, you don't seem to have any type of stern bone in your body. So I don't really understand. Like, you're demurring to your paramour and other, elements where I felt as though there were certain inconsistencies, and yeah, I was quite bored. There were too many conveniences, and I was confused why she was this person who was supposedly so clever when nothing seemed that impressive.
Right.
Everything was handed to her. But the one element that I was willing to be like, okay, clearly something is off is the many moments where anytime someone, and there's a long list of characters as well. That's another thing to note, is that at the first 4 or 5 chapters, I had to stop and just write everyone down because there are so many people. There's also just so many women specifically. I mean, we have Sherry trying to help this woman called Charlotte. And I was just like, okay, we've got Sherry, we've got Charlotte, we've got Alice, we've got someone named Mary, we've got what's her name, Janine, and I'm like, okay, there's a lot of women in this village, and I don't really understand her connection to some of them. But the thing that I was willing to keep going with was that anytime someone was like, huh, we do get a lot of murders, they were immediately cut off and distracted. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. Or we kept seeing how Sherry was trying to remember something, and then she kept losing it, being like, I know there's something important here, but I keep forgetting. And part of me was worried that we might be getting into maybe a kind of losing memory and, Alzheimer's vibes. And I was
Yeah.
just like, I really don't want that to happen, but it didn't make sense. So I just acknowledged that that could be a thing. And then I set it aside. But there is this moment where, yeah, she realizes after her boyfriend is murdered, and she's just like, this isn't right. Like, we've had so many murders, and all of them have conveniently been new people coming to town, no one I'm close with. And finally someone dies who's near her, and that's when she wakes up and says, this is actually terrible. This is horrible. This is not okay. And we see them also recognizing that probably the FBI should have been coming in at some point because there's been so many murders. Like, there's so many suspicious deaths. But I'll agree that really early on, I was thinking, okay, this might just be one of those run of the mill 3 stars for me. And I was fine with it, but I was kind of like, oh no, this might not be a fun discussion. But then things changed, didn't they?
They did. I also want to talk about the cat.
The cat.
So Lord Thomas Cromwell is his name,
Mhm.
and he is described as a fat orange cat, which I am partial to orange cats as I have Andy in my household, and so that was very fun detail to find out. But I want to discuss what we think is going on with the cat because I'm a little confused. I know that the premise, like reading the synopsis of the book, we know that her cat is potentially possessed by a demon.
Mhm.
And we do have this moment where she's sitting in her house. The sheriff, who typically doesn't want her involved in the murders, comes to her door in the middle of the night and is telling her that she needs to be investigating her boyfriend's murder. And she doesn't want to because she realizes at this point in time there's something weird going on, something nefarious, and she doesn't want really to have anything to do with it anymore. And she hides from the sheriff and ends up having a discussion with her cat. She's woken up by someone very close to her face saying, "Woman, I need food." Which at first I thought was just going to be like, it's just going to be a talking cat, like he's going to be kind of cute. But as we get further into the discussion, we realize that there might be something even more sinister behind him asking for food. He talks about himself as the Lord of Cats, and he says that he is in this predicament because he tried to eat, quote unquote, her. And her, they describe that the cat describes this character as someone who is very dangerous and has their own wants and needs, like needs their own storyline. And so I'm assuming that her, whoever that is the villain, like, is the actual person they need to purge. But then what does that make Lord Thomas Cromwell? And he seems to go back and forth into or, like, back into just being a normal cat at some point in time too. So, is he a demon? Or I mean, it seems like the demon also jumps into a whole bunch of different people's bodies because we have him inhabiting the sheriff. We have Janine, her best friend, at some point calling her, and, like, the voice is definitely not hers. And so, did the demon jump into the cat, or is this a completely different character? What were your thoughts?
My understanding was that the demon was body hopping a little bit, that her cat is, just a cat, but weirdly enough, Lord Thomas Cromwell definitely takes on some of its personality. Like, there were some descriptions, like, when he was kind of just ignoring her or decided to lick a paw instead of acknowledging his embarrassment of things, which I thought was very funny. And also, yeah, him being very rude and just expecting so much of her, being like, "Woman," and she's like, "That is Miss Pink Whistle to you." And him also having this kind of older British man accent, like calling her Mistress Pink Whistle. And that was some really fun touches, in my opinion. But my understanding is that he is a separate entity and he has inhabited Janine. He has inhabited the sheriff and then inhabited the cat, mainly just because the cat can act as surveillance when she's in her home. So that is his immediate access. And I think it speaks to the fact that it was kind of his last resort. Like, he tries Janine, he tries the sheriff, and when she closes herself off to the world, the only being that he has access to her is through this cat. So I think that's the situation that we're playing at here. That the demon and the cat aren't the same. It's just that the cat is another vessel that the demon can take advantage of. Now, this relationship with her, whoever this mysterious entity is, I've got a few theories. I think one, she could possibly not exist, that it is this entire demon just creating another, plot device, because they do have discussions of that where Sherry is realizing that every single element that is tied up in this story is from bad television or from classic television, and she's just like, this demon needs to stop watching TV. We need him to stop doing this so that we can actually get to the facts and I don't have to jump through hoops for entertainment purposes. So I could see this mysterious villainous figure just being another plot device. And it's really this lord of cats that she's trying to entertain. But there's also obviously the backstory that he provides her saying, hey, I tried to eat this demonic entity and now I'm kind of stuck in this realm just like you are as far as this reality. And I was waiting for the anyone to reference the Truman Show. I was like, there has to be a reference to this because it is so much, a one-to-one kind of parallel. And when they nodded to that, I was like, yep, check that off the list. Okay. Cause yeah, it's just an entertainment for this one, all powerful viewer. But he says that, yeah, he pretty much wronged this, entity. And now he has to act as like a servant and do everything that she wants. And that includes managing this in real life murder mystery game that Sherry is being forced to play. But my question is, did Sherry do something wrong? Why was she chosen? Why is this village of Winesap chosen in like randomly upstate New York? Those are the questions I'm having. If this entity is here, what made her choose this place of all places?
Yeah. Also, like you said, why her? She's just the village librarian, and she doesn't really seem to have, like, anything special about her, to be honest. So, yeah, why are we focusing on her solving mysteries too?
Mm,
It could be that we have, as you've referenced, we have somebody who's really obsessed with media, and so maybe whoever she happens to be, really does enjoy an amateur sleuth and someone who is kind of out of the picture, and so maybe they're just trying to make their own, as you said, Truman Show. But, yeah, I don't know. There is a quote that I wanna find, that you actually talked about with her saying, like, "All of this is just from, like, mediocre movies," and there was something about books as well, so let me find that real quick.
While you search for it, I'm actually going to read a quote of my own. This was the moment that she realizes that Alan's death is just, the beginning of so many more deaths, and the fact that it's the link to why she's been solving so many murders and she hasn't realized that this is actually a problem. So I ended up finding this in my edition in chapter 6 on page 73. Now it begins with her kind of talking to herself, saying, but it can't be, she said. It can't be Alan. Her throat was tight and achy. It's never anyone who I, dot, dot, dot. And then we get into her kind of monologue in her head. She stopped. The horror of it was clear now, clearer than it had ever been. All these people dying. There was death after death, murder after murder in tiny little Winesap. But it was true. It had never felt real because it was never anyone Sherry cared about. A village with a population of under 5,000 people, and there was somehow always someone who was new in town or whom Sherry had never spoken to or whom she didn't like very much available to be murdered in an interesting way. And then Sherry would solve it. She always solved it. She'd solve. The cases were starting to come back to her. There were so many. They'd faded into something vague and indistinct in her head, but now she could remember them all. She started to count, then gave up at 16. 16 deaths, 16 corpses. It would be an alarming number in a city 20 times the size. How on earth had they all taken this so calmly for so long? It was unnatural, monstrous, so strange and callous that it didn't make any sense. 16 deaths, and somehow every single time Sherry had ended up involved in the investigation, and every single time she'd been able to crack the case without any particular difficulty or sacrifice. And then she goes on to realizing that she knew herself. She's normal, a normal, average, endearingly disorganized librarian for whom odd coincidences always led to her solving murder cases, like something from a TV show or an Agatha Christie novel, like some sort of horrible game. And that's when she's like, something wicked is going on. And I think it's actually a really great juxtaposition to probably what you're going to reference, in that the only way that this is normalized is when it is a TV show. We joke about how St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's hometown, is like the death capital of the UK. Cabot Cove is the death capital of the United States with Jessica Fletcher. So it's very funny to have us break the fourth wall and have Sherry be like, no, I'm not in a book. Yes, Sherry, you are, but we'll get past it. I should be scared because there's so much death around me. And I love when an author does that.
Yeah, so the quote that I have is right after, so she's talking to the cat, and he tells her, um, oop, they're trying to essentially they go into a salt circle because he doesn't want anyone else to know what's going on and what he's telling her. And she says, "Do you know how to defeat her?" So, like this ominous villain in the background. And he hissed at her, "No, I cannot simply tell you. To fight a creature like her, it's a matter of subtlety. The right weapon for one man might be the undoing of another." And so she eventually gets to the point where she's frustrated with him. And it says Sherry had never been an avid reader of high fantasy. She preferred the sorts of stories that involved interesting things happening to ordinary people in the real world, for the slightly embarrassing reason that it made it easier for her to imagine getting to go on an adventure of her own. But she'd been around long enough to recognize a genre convention when she was fed one by her own fat marmalade cat. That sounds like a very thin plot contrivance. I just
Yes.
like the fact that she's recognizing that, like, no, something's this doesn't sound like a feasible reason for you not to be able to give me the answers that I'm wanting.
And that's why I feel as though because his response to her was to feed her another plot device just from a different genre that she's not as familiar with, I'm acknowledging, posing the theory that this quote unquote her isn't real, but she could be. Maybe she is, but I think that it'd be very funny if we realize that all this time it really is just this demon possessed cat who wants to continue to entertain himself. And you can see that he's going to continue popping up, but we are also finding ways to try to avoid his surveillance. So we have a Scooby gang kind of being formed. And I do think that Father Barry is very funny. Like, he is very entertaining. At first, I didn't really get him because she ends up going to church and their interaction was just kind of whatever. I was like, okay, we're meeting him for some reason. I don't really care. And then she ends up meeting him at this diner. And I love their interactions back and forth when he's like, oh, a demon problem. I didn't take that seminar. And she was like, there's a seminar. And he's like, yeah, it's at the Vatican. Like, it's kind of advanced. And so he's really nervous about it all. And there is a bit of dialogue back and forth that I thought was just hilarious. So they end up, of course, deciding to approach the sheriff because, he was banging on her door, shouting for hours upon hours last night. And that's terrifying. So something needs to be addressed. So she ends up taking the father to join her, and they witness something a bit startling. The sheriff's head does spin like a 180, like The Exorcist, and starts to speak to her in, a disconcerting devil type of voice. And they're like, okay, I think we've convinced ourselves this is a demon problem. We're going to have to move forward in that case. And they start to think about like what supplies they need to gather, who they might need to bring with them to kind of form this group. And this exchange between Father Barry and Sherry, I found it so entertaining. So Sherry decides to go buy some crystals. And Father Barry's like, crystals? What kind? She said, the kinds they have in the New Age store for the auras and things to protect us against the demons. Sherry, he said, I'm a priest. Oh, right, she said. You can't recommend anything that comes from the competitors. I'm not a vacuum cleaner salesman, Father Barry said. I have faith, Sherry. He paused. Do they have ones for demons specifically? And I think that's so funny that we are kind of juggling this kind of hilarious absurdity of being like, I'm a priest, we really shouldn't be using crystals. But also, I mean, if anything works, let's just do it. Like, I'm not going to fuss if something else ends up helping us fix this problem. And I do really enjoy that kind of exchange.
Yeah. There was also a scene, I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was they went to talk to the sheriff. It might have been when the 180-degree thing happened, but Father is his last name Barrow? I think it's Father Barrow is his Barry. It's Barry,
It's
right?
Barry, yeah, Father Barry, which is just kind of a silly name.
Yes. But he, doesn't have anything to give the sheriff to protect him, so he just hands him this rosary, and he's like, "Here you go. This might help."
Yeah, and didn't he say he's like, "Oh, I'm Lutheran." He's like, "It doesn't matter, just take it." Yeah, and then we end up gaining two additional people. We have Janine, and then we also have Charlotte, who was the woman who just lost her husband. Her husband was murdered, the art gallery owner and artist. And I will say that Janine's reaction was a bit more realistic to me than Charlotte. Charlotte just kind of laughing and accepting. I was very confused with that scene, thinking, does she actually believe her? And if she does, that seems very quick. And if she doesn't, why is she, I think she's meant to be a bit of comedic entertainment because she is the outsider. She's from the city. She's only moved to the village a few years ago due to her husband's suggestion. So she's just meant to be a bit of an outsider, kind of laughing at village life and here for the drama. But I do think Charlotte is one of the crutches that's kind of not working for me as far as the dynamic with Sherry. I don't know how you felt about that.
I did. So when they had their little powwow where Sherry reaches out to all of her friends to get the demon hunting society together for the first time, I Janine definitely had a better reaction or a more realistic reaction to me, something that was more relatable. Because if someone calls me in the middle of the night, even if it's a good friend and is like, I need to meet you to talk about this, my talking cat, I'd be like, okay, like we can talk, but I think maybe we should get some help. And Charlotte was very much, even when they all get to the demon hunting society, Charlotte was interested in the drama, as you said, when Father Barry was discussing, oh, what was it?
Was
Oh,
it the
wait, I think
bishop and
yes.
his daughter?
Yes. So we were talking about the fact that this was the Truman Show and that the demon was preventing people from coming in the town to help all of these people and with the murders that have been happening. And he says, "Well, I contacted the bishop, but he hasn't contacted me back." And they were trying to take this as evidence that the demon is keeping people out. And he's like, "Well, it might not be that. It might be because of Todd." And Charlotte's like, "Who's Todd?"
Ooh.
And Todd ends up being Barry's twin brother who has introduced the bishop's niece to the life of the party, essentially. And so there is some bad blood there between his brother and the bishop. And so that could potentially be why the bishop isn't reaching out. We also found out that Father Barry, or yeah, Father Barry is a little needy, or was a little needy when he first came to this parish. He was reaching out a lot for help. And so there are some backstories, but Charlotte the entire time is just eating it up, like, yes, yes, give me the drama. Like, I don't care about anything else. She enjoys being in a reality TV show, essentially.
Oh, for sure. And there is a bit of a kind of cry wolf situation, right? Regarding his relationship with the bishop. And the bishop's probably like, oh gosh, okay, sure, there's a demon in Winesap. Meanwhile, though, I think Charlotte's experience with her closest friend was more evidence because a few chapters earlier, when we were still dealing with the murder investigation of her husband, she was saying that her mother couldn't come down and also her best friends ended up being busy. And Sherry found this actually a little bit suspicious. She's like, "This is odd that you're reaching out to me when you should be like consoling, like being consoled by your family and friends." And Charlotte's just like, I know, I'm trying to get people down, but no one's visiting me. Her friend ends up initially having an issue with her dog. And then when they have their little group chat at the rectory, she says, now my friend's car exploded. Like there's just all these crazy things happening to these people in the outside world that are preventing them. And I felt like that was actually a good explanation as far as proof, saying, I mean, these things are very odd. This should
Yeah.
not be happening. So that made sense. But one character that we met very early on, but we don't see her too often. She seems to be in the shadows. And I see you smiling. I wonder if you know who I'm talking about. Is that Alice character, who's her neighbor. We learn very little about her. She seems to be someone who kind of keeps to herself, but they do have their routine where she ends up walking into town because neither of them have a vehicle or neither of them really have their driver's license. And she will spend a couple hours at the library reading before she goes off on her job. And Alan used to be her boss. And we meet Alice in kind of an interesting way. The way she's described is that just however many years ago, a few years ago, she just kind of showed up. She had a bruise on her face or on her eye, and then she also had her driver's license revoked. And that's all we learn. We don't know much more about her, but we do see her. I want to say it was the night of the murder, actually, the night of Alan's murder.
Yes.
And she comes and gets aid from Sherry because she loses power. Sherry assists her, and then they both go their separate ways. The next morning, Sherry wakes up and discovers that her boyfriend has been murdered. So I'm interested to see how much more of Alice we meet and how important she ends up being, because I feel like she's being kept at arm's length on purpose right now.
Yeah. I don't know if she's going to end up being the infamous her,
Mm,
because it could be. We know that obviously this character has some type of an obsession with Sherry. And we also know from various instances throughout the story now that Sherry seems to be the only person that has taken care of Alice
mhm,
and is the only person who's constantly checking on her, like doing the neighborly things, walking with her into town, letting her hang out in the library prior to her going off to her job. And so I think that that's a potential, but I also think because of the fact that she is such at arm's length and she has kind of been, we have seen her on page quite a bit. I don't know if she's going to be a red herring or, yeah.
mm. Yeah, I'm also, speaking of red herrings, wondering how much of the mystery plot we're going to get, as far as now that we know that the mystery is kind of the dressings, the decor. We're going to be probably in silly scenarios as more people maybe get murdered, and she just keeps having to solve them while trying to solve this, overarching mystery of who is this puppeteer who is forcing everyone to remain in the village and to play act these murder mystery scenarios. I'm interested to see how much investigation is actually going to take place, as far as them looking into picking up clues to figure out who her is or who this person is. So that's one thing I'm wondering, because if it's just the fact that she's placed in a murder mystery scenario, I don't know if I wouldn't call this a mystery. It's just that it's the entertainment is the mysteries that are kind of being joked about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I get that. I was thinking when we were originally in the, the crime solving, the murder investigation, it definitely felt more like we were following clues and she's bringing people in to question them and things like that. So it definitely felt like a mystery. But now that we know that all of that's staged, I don't know. I don't know how much we're going to continue. I hope that we do, because now that we have the knowledge that she's being played and she's supposed to be someone's pawn, I think it could be even more intriguing for her, cuz now she's talked about having to almost stall. Like she has to make sure that this entity still thinks that she is investigating Alan's death. And how does that what does that look like? Because as we know, with the art gallery guy who ended up dying, Charlotte's husband who died, that murder was solved in like a day. And so clearly, like these things are, just happening back to back, and we're not having much downtime. So, how is that going to look for Sherry if she has to pretend to investigate?
Mm. I wonder if what it's going to have to be is that she has to make the mystery ever more complex. Because, one, as soon as she, quote unquote, solves the mystery, a person who, either was forced to kill him against their will or didn't because it was actually the demon and they're just going to get the blame, they're now going to be forced to be prosecuted, go to prison. So you don't want to point the finger at someone that the demon will just magically make the killer, because then that person's life is ruined, on top of the fact then someone else is going to get murdered. Like, the
Right.
thing is the faster you solve the murder, the sooner someone else is going to die. So I could see there being some kind of cat and mouse chase that's inverted, in the way that they keep having to come up with reasons why it couldn't be this person. So then they have to keep investigating. And then maybe that's, running the demon through the mill, trying to be like, okay, this person, no, oh, okay, it can't be that person. Okay, this person. And yeah, maybe making the mystery take longer than it should, just to give them more time to look into who this being is and prevent more deaths along the way.
In that case, I feel like we could call it a mystery. It's a fantasy mystery, but
Yeah.
if it just drops it and that's no longer important to the storyline, I think we might run into another issue of potentially something being called a genre blend that maybe shouldn't be.
Oh, yeah, and that could in itself end up being a really interesting discussion, how frequently we're seeing genre blends being mislabeled now, or books that are being mislabeled as genre blends that actually aren't, because it could just be simply tone, right?
Right.
Because we saw that with the Cautious Traveler's Guide, that it was mysterious in tone, but that doesn't mean it's a mystery. And that's not to say that mysteries can't be designed in many unique ways. It doesn't have to be the classic, someone's murdered, now it's a whodunit. We have to figure out who did it and we're good. This is almost more of a how done it at this point, and that means we know who's causing the deaths. It's quote unquote her, or at least at the moment we're being told that it's her, and now it's more of a how done it and then how do we bring her to justice, at least in the way that this world is designed, because obviously you can't bring a demon to court. I know people want to, but it's not possible. So I do see this as being a quasi inverted mystery that is in some ways a how done it rather than a who done it, which is pretty entertaining. So if it ends up going that route, then it's definitely a genre blend.
I would agree.
Oh, also though, very kind of random, and it was mentioned, so I would imagine it's going to be brought back again. If not, it's just an odd scene. But speaking of Father Barry, way back when we were talking about him, the other thing that was odd when he was introduced was that he was connected to this Pearl Walker figure. I don't know if you remember her, because it was literally just briefly mentioned that she was this rich elderly
Yeah.
woman who lived in this mansion or this very large estate just on the outskirts of the village, because it was when Sherry was gossiping with a random woman named Mary, who was like a volunteer at the library.
Yeah.
So I don't really know if we're going to see Mary ever again. But I was like, oh, okay. Is this setting us up for another crime? Like, is Pearl Walker going to be murdered? And then we're going to assume, quote unquote, that it's Father Barry because he was asking her questions about her inheritance. So I'm wondering if there will be a hiccup where maybe they will solve Alan Walker's murder too quickly, or whatever his name is, Alan Thompson, I should say, and then maybe this random woman will die. I don't know, but it would be very odd if that's mentioned and then we never hear of this again.
Yeah, it would be, I don't know, like a weird detail to add in to the storyline. Also, speaking of weird details, I have another one that just popped
Okay.
into my head that I don't know if it's gonna go anywhere, if it was just to try and add some almost more ominous tones, some more kind of weird details at the beginning. Sherry keeps referencing Mortimer Mouse when she is talking about the sheriff.
Mm-hmm.
There was this really weird scene that felt very fever dreamish, but I mean, all of that in the beginning, it kind of felt like a fever dream, but I thought that was a really weird detail too, that she was like, "He reminds me of Mortimer Mouse," and then later in the story, someone was, reference or saying essentially that she might have kissed him or been, like, in a compromising position with him, and she's like, "Ew, I wouldn't kiss a cartoon mouse," and I'm like, "What is your obsession with him and this cartoon mouse?" Which that doesn't have anything to do with the mystery, but I'm like, there are just some weird details that I'm like, I don't know if this is the author just having fun or if these are things that I'm supposed to be paying attention to.
Yeah, I love it. Like, why are you obsessed with a cartoon mouse? Like, Sherry, we might need to talk about this. I noticed that as well because it was in originally the mention of that cartoon character was when we were trying to get this like character sketch of the sheriff. And yeah, when they try to confront him about his shouting, and she's like, "We need to talk about last night." And he basically is like, "Did I sleep with you?" And she's like, "No." Like, what? She's like, "You were shouting at me." And then he does this really odd comment where he's like, "I do remember my feet being cold," because he was outside. And I was like, what is going on? And yeah, that was just really odd. And I do remember her thinking, I wouldn't kiss a mouse. Like, what are you talking about? And it was really odd. And I think this may be due to the fact that Sherry's character is constantly referencing TV and movies.
Yeah.
I mean, we get that a lot with the references to certain like well-known mystery shows. She references Miss Marple. She specifically references Poirot, which that name is obviously Hercule Poirot from Agatha Christie, but just the title Poirot is like a BBC showing. I believe that it was like David Suchet when he was performing as Hercule Poirot. So there are a lot of references to television and movies, and I think it's just the meta type of nature of this writing. And that's one thing that I may criticize depending on how far we get into it, because there are moments in this book that I've laughed, that I've just found very funny. And I'm just like, oh, this is very absurd. I'm enjoying the back and forth between these characters. But then there are times when I know that it's supposed to be funny, but I don't find it funny.
Right.
I feel
It's
like the
too
author is
much.
trying.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's too much. And so those like mouse references, I would acknowledge that that might just be the author pushing their luck, thinking that they are a comedian when in reality they're just a funny writer, but they aren't really great at comedic timing all the time.
Yeah. Well, we could sit here and talk once again for hours, but we do need to wrap up. So I think if we're going to do the same thing that we did on our pilot book, and we're going to do our 3 questions. So we're going to say what our rating is currently, who our favorite character is in the book so far, and then a question that we have moving forward.
Ooh, okay. I'll go first. It's a little bit daunting because it is. I will say very quickly, it's interesting to decide on projected ratings so early on and then see how
Yes.
they go. So at the moment, if I had been asked at the first couple of chapters, this would have been 3 stars in my opinion. But because it's surprised me, we've gone in different directions. I enjoy a kind of book within a book meta, breaking the fourth wall, plotting, I would acknowledge that this could be 4 stars at the moment. That's where I'm going to set it. 4 stars, 4.0. It could go up depending on how entertained I am. It could go down depending on how repetitive or if, there are certain plot devices that start to irk me. But I'm acknowledging that the current quote unquote twist of this being kind of a Truman Show demon entertainment type of plot, I'll go 4.0 for that. For my favorite character at the moment, oh, now that I think about it, I was thinking Father Barry because he's a very sweet addition and he kind of breaks things up with all of the women that are surrounding him and him just kind of being a bit more kind of quiet and easily blushing. But I mean, the demon cat is great. Lord Thomas Cromwell, he's going to have to win it for this section because I really enjoyed her discussion with him and him just, being very silly. So, a question I have moving forward would be, why are we not seeing Alice as much as I expected? I want to know more about Alice. I want to know if they're going to bring her into the fold for this Scooby Gang kind of mystery, or, yeah, is she going to be kept on the outskirts? And if that's going to be important.
We will find out.
Mhm. How about you?
I think my rating is probably a 3.75 right now, maybe a
Mhm.
4. If it was within the first couple of chapters, I would have told you probably a 2 star. I was really not having a
Mhm.
fun time. But because the author did have that moment and I could see a switch and I could see how creative the beginning was, I do appreciate that, but the humor in it, I could see wearing on me a little bit. So I think that it might be a 3.75. We'll see.
Mhm.
My favorite character, I would have to agree, has to be Lord Thomas Cromwell. I can't get over it. He was so funny. The fact that he was calling her woman and asking for treats and food and
And she's like,
and
"It's a can of nasty salmon." Like, well, you're not getting a 5-star meal or anything like that.
and he was just so excited about it, and she was talking about, like, the parallels between, like, demons and cats. It was very funny. So I do think that he's definitely my favorite character so far. And then as far as my question goes, I'm gonna go back to my question about the cat. Like, I kind of feel like there's more I don't know. I kind of feel like he might be a good character for them. Like, maybe he's trying to be a little bit of a protection for Sherry and giving her hints to try and prevent her from falling into the ominous hers hands. I don't know. I'm hoping, but we'll see.
Well, that ends up kind of closing our discussion for this first episode. And now it's time for us to continue reading and move on to the second section. Remind me, what are we reading? I know we're starting on chapter 10, Danny, but where are we going to end in the next section?
You're going to be reading chapters 10 through 17 for next week's discussion.
All right. This will be interesting. Let's see if it continues to surprise us in good ways or if it ends up going downhill.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Not Reading for Content. Be sure to check the description for a schedule of our upcoming reads for this season. For reminders and other updates, you can follow the podcast on Instagram at Not Reading for Content. Where else can the listeners find you, Leandra?
I have a booktube and an Instagram. My booktube is at Leandra the TBR0, and my Instagram is at Leandra_the TBR0. How about you, Danny?
I have the same platforms. Both can be found at danny.dabbles. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to tune in next Friday for our next episode.